Well, it's with great pleasure that I introduce Christopher Grunland. Christopher is a fantastic writer. He's in high demand as a technical writer. He works with corporations to help them build their writing, their documentation. Technical writing is not an easy skill because you have to make something hard sound easy, something that's easy even easier, and he does a great job at it. He's worked for many big companies, and he also writes for himself, writes on his blog, The Juggling Writer. And his presentation today will absolutely knock your socks off. There's 107 slides of fantastic information. Get ready to write down notes, get down the information, but it is also online. It's already on SlideShare.
And I have the address at the very end.
Yeah, so don't worry, you don't have to write everything down. It's already on the web. Let's give a warm welcome to Chris.
Thank you, Tony. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Well, as Tony said, my name is Christopher Grunland, and I have a blog called The Juggling Writer, and thank you. And I also recently finished podcasting my first novel at roadtripfromhell.com. And I mention these sites because, not so you rush out and you check them out, but they're the reason I came up with this presentation. After all these meetings that we have, I chat with people and hear what things they're having issues with when it comes to creating content. So I put this together, and it came to be when I started the podcast, I looked at my statistics. And even though I'd been working on my blog for over a year, within a month or so, the podcast was getting about 4 times the traffic as my blog, and with about half the promotion. And naturally I wondered, why first am I putting so much effort into my blog? But also I wondered, what was getting people hooked on the podcast? And the answer was simple. It's sequential content. If you were into the story I was writing, if you were into a humorous coming-of-age story about a family traveling cross-country in a possessed station wagon, every single week when a new chapter came out, you had to be there to see what happened next. And I know that's the case because one time I was 2 days late, just 2 days late in posting an episode, and people were emailing. They're like, where is it? I mean, they weren't furious, but they were definitely excited and concerned that I just left them hanging. The times I've lagged on my blog usually takes 1 to 2 weeks for somebody to say, hey, what's up? So I started looking at sequential content and thinking of other ways that it could be used for the things I did online. And because I've really enjoyed the times I've been at this group, I wanted to put something together to share what I came up with. Really quick thing before we get into all the slides. It's broken up into 3 sections. The first section's a little bit of a history. And the second section actually goes more into WordPress and how you could use WordPress to manage the sequential content you're creating online. And as Tony mentioned, I'm a technical writer, so I cannot stand when somebody says, well, this is what you do. And it's like, okay, that's good. You know what to do. I don't. So I like showing people how to do things. That's how I make my living. So the whole third section is a story about a guy who comes up with a website idea. And of course, it's best case scenario. But it shows how he comes up with the idea and uses 5 elements of sequential content to grow his site from one site to many. So without further ado, we're going to begin. In the beginning, there were newspapers. Really, in the beginning, if you think about it, there were people sitting around campfires sharing stories, people painting stories on cave walls, people giving plays, writing books. But for this presentation, I decided to start with the newspaper because the way the content was delivered really doesn't differ too much from what many of us in this very room are doing online. We're not creating novels, we're creating shorter bits of content delivered regularly, and in some cases supported with advertising. The interesting thing about newspapers was it was one of the first times that culturally everybody was able to take part in something larger. Even back in the Victorian times, it cost money to buy books. But even if I didn't have that kind of money, I could find a newspaper in the street and read and see what Dickens' latest chapter is about, and I can share that experience with everybody around me. There were, of course, drawbacks to the newspaper. If, for example, I'm sitting around in a room and Sarah's in the room and Tony's in the room and we're reading a newspaper, and Sarah, since she's really into reading, reads faster than us, and she gets to something funny before Tony and I, she's laughing and Tony and I are like, what's so funny? And then we get there and we laugh, and now Sarah's crying because the writer turned things around. But it was really interesting how we jumped from newspapers to radio, because now the experience of sequential content interacting with it was immediate. Now if Sarah and Tony and I are sitting around a radio and something funny happens, we all laugh at the same time. And I think we take certain things like that for granted, and as producers of content, we really should start thinking more about those little intricacies and just how big a step it was for a family. Now they don't have to go out to see something at a theater. They can now sit there in their home and experience something. And of course, similar to the newspaper, it was supported with advertising, but it gave way to some new forms of content. Now we had the radio serial. People were hooked again on what many of us in this room are doing, creating short bits of content and delivered at a regular pace. Now obviously right now I'm talking about works of fiction. I know many people in here, they have tech blogs, they have businesses, and this may not apply to them, but I'll argue that certain things like this it applies to all of us. Because if you think about it, people were into it because they were hooked. And everything that we do, whether if you're selling something, there's a story. If you sit there and you say, this is a Logitech remote, and this is, all the stats, okay, I might buy it if I really need it, but if you tell a story about how this remote is going to change what I'm doing, I'm going to be hooked. And if it does everything you tell me in the story and I can picture myself using it, then I'm going to tell people to buy it. After radio, we moved on into movies. And movies were interesting because now it wasn't just a family sitting around a radio. Now families were going out and watching sequential content on these giant screens, dwarfing this by a long shot. And initially, the content was, again, kind of short. There were newsreels. But as the narrative expanded, people became hooked. They didn't want just one story. They wanted to know more about the characters in the stories. And thus was born the sequel. In this case, we have Jason Voorhees, guy with a hockey mask and a whole arsenal of sharp implements of destruction. And he's carried 10 films so far. Now, whether or not they're good, that's arguable. But think about the content you're creating. Are you able to create something that people want more of to the point where you could just continue generating it? Now, I think this franchise kind of rests on what they do, but there's a lesson to be learned here. If you do something that people find interesting, and you listen to the people actually using whatever you're doing online, you're able to create stuff like this. And the power of the sequel is so big that people will pay money to watch sequels fight each other. I haven't seen this movie, and I probably never will, but it does kind of show you that the power of sequential content and that people crave it so much. Even if they knock this, if they made another Freddy versus Jason, people would watch it. We know they would. After the theater, or after film, television totally changed things. Now, we were able to see things in our home. Before, we could only listen at the radio. And it brought something visual in. I'm a juggler. Mason over there with the camera, he's a juggler. If Mason and I are juggling on the radio, you just hear this patter of things in our hands. Television changed that because now you could see something in your home. And with that, people became hooked on the narratives that were being told on television. I'm sure that more than a couple people in this room have seen an episode of Lost. I'll be honest, I've never seen one episode of this show, but I know everything about it. And that's a powerful thing if you think about it. Because every day after an episode of Lost was on TV, I'd go to work and everybody would be talking about it. The minute they sat down, did you see last night's episode? That was crazy. And then the one person who watches the show who didn't see it, they're like, la 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 la, you know, don't tell me. And they go running out of the room. And then everybody would talk about it. And then since I wasn't watching it and they weren't spoiling it for me, even though now I know everything that happens, I would go get that person and tell them it's safe to come back in. When the show's season ended, people couldn't wait for the next season. Ask yourself if the content you're creating has that kind of power. If you lag in what you're doing, think about all the different places people can go to get the same kind of thing that you're doing. Unless you have something that has hooked people. You have some sequence in the content that you're creating that even if you say, hey, I'm going to be back in 2 months, people are sad to hear that, but they'll wait for it. People would wait, they waited for Lost. And I know every one of my friends, I think I'm one of the few people who didn't watch it, that last week the show was, before the whole thing ended, they were going nuts. I crave writing that kind of content that hooks people like that. Now, all this brings us to the internet.